pray, but if you have a Bible, turn to John 10. Just whip it out. If it's on your phone, that's okay. If you got it up, they're going to put it up behind me. We're going to read that in a moment, but I'm going to pray before we get in. Is that okay with everyone? And for those of you online. So, Lord, thank you for this time together. We never take this lightly. Gathering as a collective, gathering as a body, gathering as your church. And I just pray, Lord, today that you would speak to your people. May you speak to us things that we need to hear. We might not want to hear it. It may be challenging. It may be confronting. It may be encouraging. It may be those things. But I just pray, Lord, that you would speak to us regardless. And our posture is to listen. And so I pray, Holy Spirit, you would speak to your people today, for those of us in the room and online. And may this not just be information, may not just be good talk, but may it be transformation, may it be sweet nectar to the soul. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. So John 10, we're in John 10, verses 1 to 10. We kind of kept it symmetrical today, 10:10. So it says this, they're going to put it behind me. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate or door, in your translation perhaps, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Now, Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, very, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate. I am the door for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Well, good morning. As Nico said, my name is James Allen, one of the team here. I have a privilege and honor of speaking to you guys. You've joined us at an interesting time because we're in a series right now talking about the I am statements. And if you don't know what that is, it's okay, we're going to get into it. But essentially what the I am statements is, what we're trying to do with this series with you, is let Jesus define who he is for us. And there's a lot of content out there, there's a lot of Spotify audio, a lot of YouTube videos about who Jesus was, what he believed, what he stood for, why he came. But what we want to do in this series with you is let Jesus define that for us. Is that okay with you all? And so he does that through the I am statements. Now, the I am statements, they're an interesting bunch of statements. They're found in John. We've gone through some one. Pastor Jasmine did a wonderful job talking about I am the light of the world last week. And so we've started. But I want you to see that the I am statements are not just good quips. They're not just good things that Jesus said to catch attention. But they're radical insights into reality. And they're radical insights into the reality of who Jesus is, who he said he was. And so today we're going to talk about that. We're going to dive into let Jesus decide and define for us who is he. And maybe you've asked that question in your life. Maybe you're new to church. Maybe online you've never heard of Jesus. Maybe you've never heard of church. Maybe someone dragged you here today. Or you've asked that question and you've been following Jesus for a long time. Who is Jesus? I know a little bit about him. We sing songs to him. We may even push some pennies under the door to him sometimes. But who is Jesus? And he does that in the I am statements. And so today we come, as our passage, and Nico said so well, to the passage that says, I am the door. Or in some translations, I am the gate. And in particular, I am the door of the sheep. Now, this particular passage, I read it in John 10. It's an interesting passage. And before we dive in fully to that passage, I want to begin, if it's okay with you, by way of contextualization, to understand the context of what this statement is. Now, what I want you to realize, if you've read the Bible before, you've read about the sheep, you've read about I am the door, perhaps you're familiar with this metaphor. Sometimes the tendency, if we're honest with one another, is to think that this is just a nice devotional setting. Jesus is, we're the sheep, he picks us up, he rubs our head, he pats our belly, it's a good time, he takes care of the sheep. And that's fundamentally true. But this passage here represents an intense leadership critique. The whole passage of John 10 is aimed at a specific group of people. Now, while there are fundamental truths about the sheep, about the shepherd in those passages, the passage itself is directed at a group of people. And it's a harsh, harsh rebuke of those people. And those people are the religious leaders of the day. And Jesus does this to do two things. He uses this metaphor of sheep in a sheep pen to do two things. He tears down the religious leaders' claims of that time that they were the doors, they were the doorkeepers, they were the people that accessed God. But also he fundamentally, in the I am statement, says, this is who I am, that I am actually that door. You think it's you, but I am that door. So imagine it today. Imagine if Jesus came in here today. Like, great to meet you, Jesus of Nazareth here. How are you doing? Thanks for the coffee. That was really great. Great songs, guys. Could I just have all the pastoral team, all the staff, all the team members just come over here for a second? This is Jesus speaking. Yeah, you guys think you're the doors. You think you're helping people, but you're actually thieves and robbers. You're hurting my sheep. Like, imagine that context today. Jesus coming here saying that to Pastor Chris, Pastor Didi, all of our wonderful team, and just saying, you guys, you think you're getting it right, but you're getting it wrong. You're thieves and robbers, and you think you're helping people, but you're not. You're blocking them from entering the kingdom of heaven. So it's intense leadership critique, and I want you to see that before we dive in. And so he speaks to a group of people. Now, it was mentioned in the verse, and they're going to put it up behind me, called the Pharisees. Now, you might be wondering, well, if Jesus is so intense at these people, what is it that they were doing? Who were they? What did they do wrong? So glad you asked. Let's dive into it. If you read the Gospels before, if you've been in church, you might have heard of this term, the Pharisees. Now, it's mentioned in the Gospels throughout. Paul himself was a Pharisee before he got converted, before he became a follower of Jesus. It's mentioned over 100 times. But if we're in church sometimes, we don't really know who they were. We don't really know where they came from. We don't understand the fundamental context here that we need to know. So who were the Pharisees? And why is Jesus critiquing them? Now, when Jesus came into the earth, when he came into Israel, from the closing of the Old Testament to the opening of the New, there was a period of time called the intertestamental period, around about 400 to 450 years. And in that period of time, how many of you know culture changes? Things happen within a culture across years. I mean, America is 200 years or so old, and I imagine doubling that in 50 years. Like, a lot happens in those years, and we call that the intertestamental period. Now, the Pharisees came out of this period. And so when Jesus comes onto the scene, essentially at his time, there were two groups of powers. There was Rome, the Romans. They kind of controlled the military power, kind of the land that the Jews were in, they owned. They provided a tax for those people. And so they kind of had the conquest. They had the military power, the political power over the land and the people. But there was another group of people who had not necessarily a political and military power, but they had a religious power over the people. And those people were called the Pharisees and Sadducees. You may have heard of those terms. Now, they represented the religious and spiritual powers of those days. Imagine the Catholic Church 500 years ago, just very powerful, controls the law of the land, a lot of weight to the people. Now, the Sadducees, on the one hand, they were more political people. They cozied up to the Romans. They enjoyed the title. They enjoyed having money. And eventually, they became a little bit corrupt and a little bit elitist. And so another group looked at the Sadducees, and they said, we don't want to do that. We want to be different. And so that group was called the Pharisees. Now, if you remember Old Testament history, you'll be familiar when the Old Testament closes, Israel was in a period of exile, but they come back and they're rebuilding their land. Now, essentially what the Pharisees did was look at history, look at the Old Testament, look at the people of the Jews, look at their time and their history and their culture, and say, why is it that we keep getting judged? Why do we keep failing? Why do we keep getting exiled? God, why do you keep forgetting about us? And so in study and in hoping to avoid that, what they did is they looked at the cycle. Israel sins. They forget God's law. They forget to be the people that God's called them to be. So they get exiled, and they cry out to God, and God returns them. And the Pharisees looked at that and said, if we're going to break this cycle, if this generation's going to be different than the last, if we're going to get it right, we need to break this cycle. So the question is, well, how do we do that? And so the Pharisees became obsessed with the law, obsessed with keeping God's ways, God's law, God's things of doing things. And so essentially the Sadducees, where they became the kind of political powers, they had the kind of the title, they made up the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees became the keepers of the law. And so if you wanted to get to God, you had to follow the law. But if you wanted to get to God, you had to go through the Pharisees. You had to do what they told you to do. And so they did two things. Two things happened here that I want to draw attention to before we dive in. Number one is they enforced the law. So they enforced the law on the people very heavily. And not only did they enforce it on people, said you've got to follow this if you want to do the right things, but they criticized and ostracized anyone who didn't do as they said. And Jesus, he was really critical of the way they did this, the way they enforced the law. He says it like this in Matthew. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So they do have some authority. They sit on Moses' seat. So listen to them. So do and observe what they tell you, but not the works they do. So this is Jesus' gripe with the Pharisees. For they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. And so they enforced the law, but on the other hand, they added to the law. So what do I mean by that? If you know the Old Testament, there was around about 613 laws that the Jewish people had to observe. It's a lot of laws, right? But the Pharisees looked at that and they said, wouldn't it be great if not only we observed the law, we followed these laws, but we went even the extra mile? And so instead of just cleaning the windows, we cleaned the frames too. And not only that, we got the cobwebs. Maybe we even covered the frames with a nice film. And so this is what they did with those 613 laws. And so actually what they did is they took the 613 and they added around 1,500 more. So 1,500 more laws that now the people of God have to observe if they're supposed to be God's people. And so you have things like this. Most of us know the Sabbath. It's in the Ten Commandments, keep the Sabbath holy. It says this, you have let go of the commands of God. The Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is in the Exodus and Deuteronomy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath, so keep it holy. So don't work on that one day. So the Pharisees looked at this and they said, that sounds great, the Sabbath. Cool, let's do that, but how can we take it to the next level? And so they added 39 laws to that one law. Things like this. On the Sabbath, you couldn't swat a fly. You couldn't spit on the Sabbath. That was another law they added. Women, sorry to say, in this time, you couldn't look at your reflection on the Sabbath. That was seen as unholy and sinful. So that was a law they added. There was a really funny one that I read in the Mishnah, that if your house is burning down on the Sabbath, you can't carry any clothes out, but you can try and put on as many as you can. And that seems to be okay. So it's interesting. And so the Pharisees, they added to the law, they enforced it on the one hand, but they added things to it. That to us seemed very funny. But by adding these two things, by enforcing the law and adding to it, what did they do to the people? They made it impossible to follow the law. Like how many of you can follow 2,100 laws, let alone recall them, let alone follow them? It just doesn't make sense. And so what happened is they became harsh critics of the people. If you weren't doing the laws that they had added, following them, you were ostracized and criticized. And so they developed significant power over the people as a result. And they became sort of the doorkeepers, if you like, the gates to the law. If you wanted to follow the law, you wanted to be a good Jew at that time, you go through the Pharisees, you listen to them. There was no other option. Essentially, getting to God. To get to God, you go through the Pharisees. Just as many as you've walked into here today through those double doors to meet God, imagine Pharisees standing there. The entrance is through them. And so Jesus, if you've read the Gospels, was very critical of the Pharisees. And it's something you see in the New Testament. If you've picked up the Gospels and you've read, he's always kind of attacking the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He's always got something to say. And so throughout the New Testament, there's a tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. You could say that Jesus' relationships with the Pharisees is like my relationship with my wife when I don't make the bed right. Little tense, some choice words said, a little bit of aggressive, some harsh rebuke, some choice words. And so Jesus was critical of the Pharisees. So the question is why? Well, why was he critical of the Pharisees? He was critical because instead of being the doors that opened and helped people enter into the presence of God, into the kingdom of heaven, they were more like stumbling blocks. And they were a blockage, and they enforced it on the people in harsh and aggressive ways. And so before John 10, before the passage that we just read, this tension of Jesus and the Pharisees, it reaches a climatic point. It reaches a palpable point. And Jesus heals in John 9 a man born blind. And it says this, as he went along, this is Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, some important contextual notes to this passage. Being born being born blind back then wasn't like today. We didn't have charities for the blind. We didn't have disability acts. We didn't have laws and regulations protecting people with ailments and disabilities. No, having a disability back then, like blindness, meant something was fundamentally wrong with you. You were someone to be avoided because something was going on there that we're not sure about. And often what the religious leaders believed back then is if you had a disability, it was probably because someone had sinned in your family. There was a generational curse going on there. Either you had sinned yourself, so God had cursed you by blinding you, or someone in your family, your parents, maybe a loved one, had sinned, and so you were blind as a result. And that's why the disciples asked this question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? This was the common belief, that he was born blind. And so often if you had a disability, not only did you have a blindness or a deafness or a leprosy, you were often excluded as a result from community. And so this meant you were not only excluded from hanging around with your community, but you were excluded from things like synagogue worship or entering the temple. I mean, just think about that for a minute. The very place those people need to be, they were excluded from because of this belief. And so in other words, you became someone to avoid. If you had a blindness, if you had deafness, someone to avoid. You were unclean, you were sinful. Why would I hang out with that person? There's something wrong with them. So imagine that today in our culture. Imagine if we had signs outside today that said, everyone blind, everyone in a wheelchair, everyone deaf, we're going to worship in here and we're going to have a good time, but you guys, you can stay out there. And you can beg, we're okay with that. You can ask people for money, but you can't enter into the presence of God. That's too much. Just think about that. So that's the context of John 9 today. And so Jesus sees this man and being overwhelmed with compassion and being the wonderful person that he was, he heals the man. And he tells him, go to the pool, wash in the pool, and then go back. So the man does that. So as he returns after being healed, after encountering Jesus, he gets his sight back. He comes home and he's questioned. Immediately off the bat, we told in the text that he's questioned by his neighbors. Who did this to you? Who's healed you? Who's touched you? Wasn't this the guy that was the beggar out there? Who did this to you? Who healed you? So his neighbors, being confused, they eventually bring him in front of the Pharisees for questioning. Now just think about that for a moment. Instead of celebrating the man, instead of saying, you can see, how did this happen? Tell us more. Instead of worshiping God, saying, look what God has done to this man. He has made him see again. The immediate tendency is questioning. So they bring him before the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees look at this man, and they too are like the neighbors. Who did this to you? Where is this man who did this to you? And they can't celebrate it. They can't see past him healing the man on the Sabbath. They can't see past it. And they say things like this: you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us, to the blind man? And they threw him out. Just think about that. Instead of celebrating him, the religious leaders of the day, the doorkeepers, the people who were supposed to enter in through these people, instead of welcoming this man back, they don't celebrate. They're not even happy. They just interrogate him, insult him, and then they throw him out. And so where Jesus had the intention of not only healing the man so he could see, but restoring him to community, restoring him so he could go and enter worship finally for the first time in his life. He could enter the temple. He gets to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees not only reject the healing, they reject the man and they throw him out. They say, nah, you still can't enter. So Jesus sees this in John 9. And he comes at the end of John 9, there's a little interesting passage, and he finds that this man has been kicked out. He finds him and he's thrown him out. So Jesus begins to confront the Pharisees. He's had enough. And he does this in our passage today of John 9. And to set up his confrontation, to confront the Pharisees, he doesn't do it with just immediate words. He uses a metaphor. And he uses a metaphor of sheep and a sheep pen. Now, sheep and a sheep pen, any farmers in here? One farmer? Any shepherds in here? Maybe online? Right, that's my point, right? We don't really understand that metaphor. It's kind of lost on us. We all go to the grocery store to get our food. We don't really raise livestock. We're not really familiar with sheep. I don't even think I've seen a sheep pen since I've been here in the open. Right? You don't see many job ads out there like shepherd needed ASAP, we'll pay cash. Indeed.com, like shepherd needed, we'll pay tomorrow. Degree qualifications, shepherding, experience with lambs preferred. You know what I mean? We don't see this. It's not a common metaphor. But in Jesus' time, this metaphor, sheep pen and shepherds, was extremely common. People would have noticed it. People would have understood immediately as he was using this metaphor. And so Jesus chooses to use this metaphor to attack and confront the Pharisees' corrupt leadership. So now, begs the question, sheep pen and sheep. Well, what does a sheep look like? I'm glad you asked. Put up the image of the sheep. Outrageously cute. I think I Googled cute sheep, baby sheep, to find that, and I was like, oh Lord, this metaphor just lands differently now. That's a sheep, right? So cute, outrageously cute, even, you would say. But what does a sheep look like? Like, what is a little lamb like that, a little sheep like? What do? They roam, they get lost, they get dirty, they need feeding, they need clipping sometimes, they need taking care of, they need protection, right? From the elements, from coyotes here, back then wolves. And so sheep, the metaphor here, a sheep like this, outrageously cute but incredibly vulnerable. And so that's a cue to us here, because sometimes we treat this as like we're the little sheep, Jesus loves us, which is fundamentally true. He chases us for the 99. But Jesus is calling you and I sheep. What does that mean? Without the protection of the shepherd, we are lost, and we will be devoured by wolves. And those wolves may look different today, but that's the fundamental truth. Interesting. So, beautiful cute. So not just a cute metaphor, but a radical insight. Jesus used this metaphor intentionally. And so one of the ways you would protect a little sheep like this is you'd put him in this. Sheep pen. May not look the best today, but that's what you'd put them in. It was a stone enclosure. Usually you'd have a round or circular or square shape. And there's a little gap there. You call that the entrance or the door or the gate. And so that's where the sheep would come in. They would come out to graze. They would come out to sleep at night. And so usually this entrance, this little gap, you didn't put a door on it. Instead, what would happen is you'd have a doorkeeper or a shepherd. And the shepherd at night, when he brought the flock in, he would lay in that entrance. And he would be the barrier between things getting in to attack the sheep. And he would be the barrier of protection. In other words, he would be the door between the sheep and the external world. And so basically acting as the door or the barrier, if you like, between the sheep and anything external trying to get in. And so the sheep would come out when he would get up, let them out, and they would come in, and he would be protected. The sheep would find pasture and rest there. So Jesus, in our passage, he claims, looking at this, that he is that door. The gap there, Jesus is that door. He is the place that protects the sheep. Not only brings the sheep in to protect them at night, to give them pasture, to graze, to lead them, but he is the door that keeps them safe from external forces trying to enter. He is the one that is the door for the sheep. Basically, the way that the sheep enter to find pasture is through Jesus. They come in through him and they go out through him, and they are protected by him in this sheep pen. And so Jesus doesn't stop here. He goes on and he says, not only am I the door, but everyone that's come before me is a thief and a robber. Just think about that for a minute. Incredibly bold statement to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders of this day. It's like, ouch. Jesus is saying that the Pharisees, they're the thieves and robbers who are trying to get in through illegitimate ways to the sheep. But they have no claim because they are thieves and robbers. They don't have good intentions. They have bad intentions. They're not helping the sheep. They're harming the sheep. They're thieves and robbers. And so it would be the equivalent of Jesus coming in today, use the metaphor I used a little bit earlier, saying all the pastors, Pastor Chris, Pastor Didi, Pastor Jasmine, Pastor Nico, we love you guys. Grateful for you. You think you're helping the sheep, but you're not. You're thieves and robbers. And instead of giving the sheep life, helping them enter through the door, you are the stumbling block. You're thieves and robbers, and you're illegitimate in the ways that you are approaching these sheep. Incredibly bold statement. So this whole passage in John 10 is aimed at the Pharisees. He's criticizing their leadership. You think you're helping people, but you're not. You think you're taking care of the sheep. You think you're the door, but you're closing the door off to people to enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's an incredible, bold statement. And so Jesus is rebuked, not only in this passage in John 10, but throughout the whole testament of Scripture, is intensely strong to leaders who fail. Leaders who think they're doing the right things, but are harming the sheep. Here it is in Matthew, and it's so strong. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Incredible. So Jesus' words here in John 10, this metaphor of the sheep and the sheep pen, the door, the shepherd, is a harsh critique on how the Pharisees were leading the people at that time. They're not helping the sheep. They think they are. They think that they're the doorkeepers to the sheep, but they're not helping. They're not the doors. They're like the thief who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. That's what the Pharisees are doing here. Jesus says this, the way you are doing religion is doing violence to my flock. I've come that they might have life, but you've come to steal, kill, and destroy them. Incredible. So what I want you to see today, that's a little bit of context. What I want you to see today in this passage is how this metaphor still outworks in our lives. Is that okay with you guys? I believe there's three things in this passage that Jesus wants to communicate still to us today. And those are three things, and they're going to put them up behind me. Voices, doors, life. Voices, door, life. So number one, voices. It says this in the passage in John 10, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and he leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow because they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they'll flee from him, they'll run from the stranger because they do not know the voice of strangers. So put up that picture of the sheep pen again, if you wouldn't mind. So often with this metaphor, in real life with the shepherds, not just one group of sheep, not just one flock, but 2 or 3 would be gathered. And you'd have different shepherds owned by different people. And so they'd all gather in the same sheep pen to preserve money. It was cheaper and cost effective. So you'd have multiple flocks in the same pen. And so basically when the shepherd of one flock wanted to call his sheep, it's like time to go, we're going to move to a different pasture, he would call his sheep. And it was only those sheep that knew that shepherd's voice who would respond. They would call. The shepherd would call, come on, let's go. And the sheep would follow. They would know, and they wouldn't get mixed up with the other flocks. Now, again, that metaphor is slightly lost to us because we don't really spend time with sheep. We don't really call sheep. When was the last time some of you called a sheep? That's my point. So here is a video of my wife being a shepherd for the day with some shepherds in England. Here's the video. There's the little sheep. So we were with the shepherds at this time. The shepherd was calling them. You see how they're following. And now I'm here filming Liv getting in trouble with the sheep. Look at them. There they are. So it was like 50 sheep. You'd get in, they'd be on the other side of the green, of the other side of the pasture, and the shepherd would call, come, like that. And all these sheep would come running and bearing. It's amazing. So what's my point with that video? The sheep know their shepherd's voice. They just know it. They learn over time, over proximity to the shepherd, over time spent with the shepherd. They know that this shepherd, the voice of that shepherd, is the voice of protection, hearing, feeding, care, all these different things. The shepherds know their sheep, and the sheep know the voices of their shepherds. So I have a question for you. What are the voices you are listening to? What are the voices you are listening to trust in? To lead you, to form you, to guide you, to shape you as a person? What are the voices you are listening to? One of the first things you teach kids, parents, you'll understand this, and one of the first things I was taught as a child is don't listen to a stranger's voice. If someone's calling you that you don't recognize, run. Don't go near the car, don't go near the candy, near the puppy, run. Any parents agree with that statement? Like how many of you late at night tonight, let's say it was midnight, you hear a bang on the door, someone speaking who you don't recognize, shouting. You're like, yeah, it feels good to let that person in. I trust them. Yeah, I know. I don't know their voice, but it sounds familiar. It's okay, I'm going to let them in. Like no one has that, right? But they don't have good intentions. And we recognize that because we don't know their voice. There's no proximity there. There's no relationship. It may sound like they have good intentions, but we don't know their intentions. And can I say this? There are voices in you and I's life that are calling for your attention. There's voices every day calling for your attention. And they may sound like life. They may sound like they're promising life and life abundant. But in reality, they're the voices of thieves and robbers, imposters and liars who are calling you and acting as if they're the shepherds, but they're not. They're the thieves and robbers whose sole intention is to steal, kill, and destroy. Some of you are listening to voices today, whether here and online, that have promised you life but cannot provide it. And it seems good. It seems like it's the right voice. It seems honest and pure. But the intentions are not. And the results are devastating. Chase this person, chase this relationship, chase this experience, do that thing again, have that experience again. go to that place with that person, text that person at this time of night, watch that video again. That will make you happy. Can I say this? There's all these voices speaking into our lives, and yet Jesus' promise today to us is that when you will hear his voice, you will know it and you will listen to it. And when you hear the stranger's voice, the imposter, the thief, or the robber, you won't listen to it. In fact, you'll run from it. You'll flee. You'll run from the voice. So Jesus' message to us is, hear my voice. And how do you learn to hear somebody's voice? Time. Time spent in the sheep pen with the shepherd, so that you can hear the voice, so that you can tell it apart from the stranger, so you can tell it apart from the other voices. I think Jesus' message to you, if you feel like that resonates with you, if you're listening to voices today that you know you shouldn't, maybe you've even given in, is listen to Jesus. Hear his voice, you'll know it. You'll experience love, grace, peace, joy, life to the full. And in so doing, when you hear the stranger's voice, you will run from it. Can I say this? Some of you are running towards voices you need to run away from. You need to turn and run away from. Listen to Jesus. The sheep know his voice. You can trust the voice of Jesus. And so number 2, doors. We live in a world of doors. We're familiar with that, right? We woke up, we went out of our house door, we got into our car door, we came into the church's doors, and now we're here. We're familiar with doors, but doors is a powerful metaphor, because not only is a door an entryway into something else, both physically in the world, but it's also a good metaphor spiritually. I remember talking to a man years ago, about 3 years ago, and he was talking to me about how he was exposed to pornography at a really young age. Around 8 to 10 years old, he was exposed to pornography. And he didn't ask to be. He wasn't looking for that. But somebody opened a door in his life and said, walk through that because behind it's life. Go through that door, run ahead. There's life in that door. He didn't ask for that door to be opened. He didn't even want for that door to be opened, but it was opened for him. And it robbed him. It robbed him with a lifelong addiction to pornography and a battle that, thank God, now he's found victory in. But a long, long battle that was robbing him, promising him life, lying, being the imposter, the thief, the steal, kills, destroys. And he was robbed. And maybe some of you today, that's you. You've had doors opened in your life. Doors that you didn't ask to be opened through childhood, through adulthood, through an experience for a moment, and it's haunted you. It's a door that you never wished or intended to be open. Perhaps it was opened by somebody else, a friend, a family member, someone you trusted. And you were told, go through that door. Maybe you even pushed through it. And life is on the other side, but instead of finding life, it was stealing, killing, and destroying. Can I say this to you? I think Jesus' message to you is clear. Come to me. Come receive healing for that time. Receive moment. Close that door. Go through me. Go through the true door. Enter through me and you'll have life, not just life, life to the full. Come receive healing, restoration, renewal that I offer. And on the other side, some of us have had doors open for us. But can I say this? For some of us, perhaps in the room and online today, we're trying to find life in the wrong doors. We're walking through doors, perhaps peeking through them, or maybe we're even running through them, trying to find life. Some of us are entering into relationships with people that we know we shouldn't to find intimacy because we're so desperate to experience intimacy and an experience with someone who could love us. We're looking into a door to find life that's not there. Some of us were entering the door of pleasure. We are pushing open that door, maybe even curiously peeking through, thinking that through that door will be the life that I want. Through that door will be the life that will satiate me at the deepest part of me. For some of us, we're being dragged through the door of materialism or work or the demand of money on our lives. We're just saying, if I could get this car, if I could get this amount of money, this job, then I will be satisfied. If I could go through that door, if I could enter it, then I will have life and life to the full. Can I say this to you guys? Do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. There are doors in your life that promise life. But they're thieves and they're robbers. And behind that door, it may look good, it may even feel good right now, but it's not life. It's not life. Can I say this? Some of us spend our entire lives banging on doors, insisting for God to open them, insisting, Lord, open this door, because we think behind it there's life. We think it contains life, but all it does in the end is rob us. Can I say this? Sometimes the biggest threat to Christians isn't spiritual warfare, it isn't the enemy, it isn't a political ideology or a political party. It's Christians insisting on opening doors that God never intended to be opened because they think it contains life. Can I say that to you guys? Letting in the thieves and the robbers, letting in the illegitimate shepherds into our lives. And can I say this? What doors are you entering today? What doors have been opened for you perhaps on the other side? What are the doors that need closing? What are the doors that you think contain life, that you're walking through, maybe cautiously, maybe boldly, that you think contains life? Can I say this? Jesus' claim to us in this passage, that I am the door, is radical, not only because he claims to be the door, but the only door. He doesn't claim to be a door or an opportunity of doors or a door that you might take sometimes. He claims to be the sole door that leads to life, and not just life, life to abundant. And that at the deepest core of who you are as human beings, everything you want to manifest in life, for your life, whatever it may be, is not found in another door, but through this door, through Jesus, through the I am. I am the door. I am the door. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So what voices are you listening to today? A lot of voices out there. What doors are you looking at today? What doors have you entered? What doors are you looking at, perhaps, surveying, thinking that has life? And could it be today that Jesus has something better for us? So as I invite the worship team, they can come back up in a moment. I want to finish with the third one, and that's life. It's interesting to me, the analogy Jesus uses, because he uses the thief, whose sole intention is to kill, steal, and destroy. But then he uses his analogy. He is the door. And instead of killing, stealing, and destroying, it's life, and it's life to the abundant. What's interesting to me about that is two things. One, we don't get to determine where we get life from. It's already kind of set. The thief and the robber, their intentions are set. We may think that they offer life, but they can't offer life. But on the other side of that, Jesus is the person who claims to offer life. So what is Jesus saying to us today, 2024? I think he's saying, come to me. I think he's saying, return back. The interesting thing about the analogy with the sheep is, what do sheep do? They roam, they get lost, they go through other doors, they get mixed up with other flocks, they get lost from time to time. And maybe you feel like that today online. Maybe you feel like, I've tried to find life and pasture in other ways. I've tried to listen to other voices. I've tried to open other doors, and it has not satiated me. And I think Jesus' words to you are clear. Come to me, because I've got life for you, and it's life to the full, where you can find intimacy, you can find protection, purpose, identity, community, where you can find this in me as the door. I am the door, and I am the door to life. So I want to ask you 3 questions today, if that's okay with you all. What are the voices you're listening to? What are the doors you are opening or have opened that need closing? Is there a thief in your life? Is there something that is robbing you of your God-given joy? Is there something that is robbing you today? And you just want to lay it at the feet and you want to say, I don't want to be robbed anymore. I want this life, Jesus. If you've promised it, I'm going to take you on your word. And the last question is, will you come to Jesus for that? And I'm aware that many of us in this room and online today, that might look differently, and that's okay. I'm not trying to fit you all in a box. You must respond in your own way. But can I say this? It's never too late to enter the door. It's never too late to experience Jesus, experience his grace and his forgiveness, his healing, his restoration. It's never too late. Don't follow the stranger's voice. Learn to hear the shepherd. Don't believe the thief. Don't be robbed. Don't be sold out. Believe in Jesus.